Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, I have heard of Buddhas who have become enlightened in total solitude. By meditating on dependent origination, they gain insight into the true nature of reality. This has confused me and given me some doubts.
How so?
Is it possible to attain enlightenment all on one's own? To penetrate the true nature of reality in complete solitude? As you might suppose from my chosen name, the idea appeals to me.
That is an interesting question. At the core of it is another question, I think. Is ultimate reality self-evident? On the one hand, the truths of suffering, desire, and impermanence are obvious to us all just by looking around. On the other hand, the subtle truths of the nature of emptiness, of interdependent non-arising, and of suchness are not so obvious. Moreover, can one save others in solitude? I'm not sure.
I strongly suspect that it is possible to save others in solitude, though I slightly suspect my preference for solitude colors that opinion. Still, I think there is much one can learn in solitude, should one be disciplined and observant enough to find those lessons. After that, one who is articulate enough to present those lessons and prudent enough to record them can save others by passing on their knowledge.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be discussing Pratyekabuddhas. What are Pratyekabuddhas? What is their status in the canon? How ought we understand them? We hope you enjoy.
So, to start with, who or what are the Pratyekabuddhas?
They are a type of being in the world who achieve enlightenment completely by solitary means. Their name literally translates to solitary Buddha, and they are said to be those beings which achieve not only enlightenment, but fully realized Buddhahood by solitarily meditating on the nature of dependent origination. Dependent origination is something we have discussed at various points in the show, but we will do a full episode on it in the future. The defining characteristic of these Pratyekabuddhas is that they do not have a Sangha, a community, and they never hear the Buddha preach the Dharma. Similarly, they never teach others or save others. We have gotten through just the definition, and there are several things worth discussing. First, these beings are not just enlightened beings, which we would call arhats. They are Buddhas. Now, it is important to mention that we can't always say that they are specifically fully realized Buddhas, because there are some later texts which say that Pratyekabuddhas are not all the way there, and the reason why is because they haven't taught or saved anybody else along the way. But they are Buddhas. The fact that they are Buddhas without teaching or saving anybody else calls the entire definition of Buddhahood and being a Buddha into question, and this is something that we will discuss in a moment. It's important to note that there are very few, if any, true named Pratyekabuddhas in the canon anywhere. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of named bodhisattvas, and there are named arhats, but only a few Pratyekabuddhas. And they are only named in the sense that they are individuals listed as Pratyekabuddhas. Because they have no Sangha and they hear no Dharma, they obviously are not named in the audience of the Buddha when he preaches in most cases. One of the only places where they are named and described in any length is in a section of suttas in the Pali Canon, which are life histories of great individuals in Buddhism. This section of the suttas is called Apadana.
Before we continue, what all do we know about Apadana?
These Apadana texts are dialogues between Ananda and the Buddha, where Ananda asks about these great individuals in the history of Buddhism, and the Buddha talks about some of them in some detail. These stories are included in the Khuddaka Nikaya of the Pali Canon.
Do we know when the Apadana was composed at all? What background do we have on these suttas?
That's a good question. Most of the Khuddaka Nikaya was composed in the first 3 meetings of the original Sangha, a couple of centuries after the Buddha's death. It was composed with a lot of other suttas in the Pali Canon, usually from oral tradition and memory. So these councils came together to make sure that they all agreed on what the sermons had said based on the recitations that they had been doing after the death of the Buddha, and they started writing them down according to those later on close to the 2nd, 3rd, 1st century before the Common Era. So a lot of these texts antedate the life of the Buddha by about 200 years. So this is a very interesting point where some people can enter in and say that this or that text is apocryphal, or that this version is incorrect, or things like that. And this is around the time that a lot of Mahayana suttas are finally starting to be written down as well. So it's a very interesting time of transition for Buddhism as oral tradition gets turned into written tradition. In the Apadana stories, Ananda asks, Pratyekabuddhas are said to exist. By what reasons do they become wise? And the Buddha describes them as having these characteristics. They have fulfilled their duties to past Buddhas, but have not attained liberation yet. They can attain very sharp wisdom from a small object of meditation without any instruction. They are free from passions and desire and conceptualizations. They observe nonviolence. They are morally pure and wise and disciplined in meditation. They cultivate the desire for Buddhahood in the absence of instruction. There are several characteristics here that mess with my head. How have they fulfilled their duties to past Buddhas? Did they once have a Sangha and now they no longer have one? That would mean that their karma was too poor to attain enlightenment in their past lives when they had a Sangha, but it's good enough now that they can attain enlightenment even without one? Also, what causes them to have a higher capacity for wisdom attained through meditation than the average arhat or the average practitioner? If people can have such a capacity, then do they need to be taught at all? Furthermore, if they know about moral purity, then does that mean they understand karma as well? We know that they understand the 12 links of dependent origination, but are we to assume that they have essentially extrapolated the entire Dharma from that doctrine alone? Finally, the desire for Buddhahood in the absence of instruction is a bit contradictory here, because how would they know what Buddhahood is? Desire necessarily requires an object of desire. If they do not know what Buddhahood is because they have never been told what it is, then how can they desire it? Moreover, another point says that they are free from desire and passions and conceptualizations. So how can they desire for something if they are free from desire at all? These questions and more plague the status of Pratyekabuddhas in the canon.
So let's talk about that. What is their status in the canon?
Even in the Pali Canon, where there's more information about them, there is a hierarchy established, with fully realized Buddhas at the top, Bodhisattvas one step below, Pratyekabuddhas below that, and Arhats below that. This hierarchy has never been the target of the interdenominational sniping we see in the Mahayana texts. The target of that has always been the fact that Theravada human beings go after the Arhat path for their own reasons, and the Mahayana people go for the Bodhisattva path also for their own reasons. It's not a difference of names and definitions, it's a difference in practice and purpose. So thinking about that hierarchy, let's ignore the Pratyekabuddha's position for a moment to understand how the hierarchy is organized. The principle by which this hierarchy was established was on the grounds that Arhats achieve enlightenment for themselves, Bodhisattvas cause others to achieve enlightenment, and Buddhas essentially do both. Thus, Pratyekabuddhas ostensibly achieve Buddhahood without saving anybody else, which according to the principle of the hierarchy we mentioned here, should be impossible. In later Mahayana texts, it is outlined that the three things which are absolutely necessary for one to achieve fully realized Buddhahood are for the practitioner to make an offering to a Buddha, hear a Buddha preach, and have their future Buddhahood prophesied by an existing Buddha. How can a Pratyekabuddha do this? They have no Sangha, they hear no Dharma, and they preach no Dharma. So when are they going to interact with a Buddha? The only thing I could even think that they could do is that they could make an offering to a Buddha. But you have to consider that they may not even know what a Buddha is or who the Buddhas of the various realms are. If that really is the case, they may not even be able to make an offering. This is made more complicated by a characteristic of Pratyekabuddha that I was saving for this question. This other characteristic is that they are said to arise in an age where there are no Buddhas and the Dharma is completely lost. This is contradicted by several later doctrines, which argue that there is one Buddha with an immeasurable lifespan who was enlightened in the immeasurably distant past and exists even when there is no manifest Buddha in the realms of transmigration. Furthermore, if they arise in the age when there are no Buddhas and no Dharma, then why don't they teach anybody else? In this sort of age where there is no Buddha and no Dharma, it's said that Maitreya will come down from the Tushita heaven and be the new Buddha to spin the wheel of the Dharma over again. Are the Pratyekabuddhas supposed to do that? Are they supposed to be involved in that? This age of no Buddha and no Dharma is said to be the worst age to exist in, because you're caught in that spot where the Buddha Dharma is gone, the suffering of sentient beings is the highest, and the Buddha of the future, apparently, has not arrived yet. Thus, how can they be a Buddha if they don't remedy the suffering of sentient beings in such a time? It is said that in the Lotus Sutra, for example, every Buddha, in every realm, in every age, preaches the Lotus Sutra. Do Pratyekabuddhas do that? It's hard, nigh impossible, to know. One more thing that we should mention about their status in the canon is that their existence inadvertently defines the very nature of the Dharma in a possibly controversial way. If Pratyekabuddhas have the ability to perceive reality exactly as it is, and thus access Buddhahood with only what is in front of them, meaning only phenomenal reality as it appears to us, that means that the Dharma exists here, and not beyond a distance of training, study, realization, revelation, etc. This is controversial because it redefines enlightenment and the pursuit of Buddhism entirely. It totally removes teachers from the equation. It eliminates the true need to study the sutras, and it basically argues that everybody can inherently know enlightenment when they see it. To go back to our common chocolate metaphor, it is saying that you don't have to go off and taste chocolate yourself to know what chocolate tastes like, and to know you're eating chocolate and not something else. The true nature of reality is not paved over by defiled or impure reality. This is contradictory to everything in the canon prior to at least the 7th century CE. Up to that point in history, the whole idea behind the enlightened and unenlightened state in the early canon was that this phenomenal reality is impure and defiled, and we have to purify those states in ourselves to be able to achieve omniscience. There was a clear gap between how things are now and how things could be, and the onus was on the individual to do what was necessary to achieve that state. This involved a renunciation of all impure and defiled things in that impure and defiled reality. In this scheme, Pratyekabuddhas can exist, because all that they have available to them is not enough. Then, later, we got original enlightenment, where the idea was that the unenlightened state contained purity at its core, but it was paved over with defilement and impurity. And the thing that we had to do was to unpave reality and our perception of it to see the Buddha nature, the original enlightenment, at its core. By definition, reality in this case is no longer thought of as being inherently defiled and impure, but is instead inherently pure, but just covered up. In this scheme, Pratyekabuddhas can exist only if it is possible to do that unpaving in solitude, without an instructor or a community. That is a matter of great contention because, like we've been saying, to unpave reality without instruction is to essentially blindly search for the taste of chocolate when you may not even know that chocolate exists. How is this possible? It is in this 7th century CE period and beyond where we get esoteric ideas that argue that all of reality is the Dharma unfolding before us and instructing us all the time, and as such, it is not paved over in any sense of the word. In this scheme, Pratyekabuddhas could exist, because reality presents itself exactly as it is. However, in the esoteric way of understanding things, the unfolding of reality is the sermon of Mahavairocana, which means that every sentient being is being preached to all the time, and means that there cannot be a solitary Buddha because solitary Buddhas are never preached to.
So that was a whole lot of going back and forth with the definitions, and so just in general, how ought we understand Pratyekabuddhas?
I'm going to be fully honest with you here. I simply don't know. I don't have the slightest clue. I have never gotten a satisfactory answer to this question. I don't think there is one, since they are such minor characters in the canon, and since they are impossible to know by definition. I have some theories which I have applied to other classifications of beings in the canon, which I may be able to apply here, which might help us understand them. You might remember when we have talked about Echantikas in the past. They are beings who, in spite of anything and everything, never attain enlightenment. They could be very morally pure or impure, very wise or very deluded, but one way or the other, given a measurable time, they simply do not attain enlightenment and nirvana. This could be due to doubting and slandering the Buddha Dharma, or it could be due to any number of other reasons. I have a theory that they don't actually exist, but they are named as a theoretical category of beings. There are an immeasurable number of sentient beings, and due to the law of large numbers, there must be sentient beings with any characteristics that can be imagined and more, one of which being this characteristic of never reaching enlightenment. Just because we can imagine that characteristic and can discuss how it fits into this or that scheme of the Dharma does not mean that these characters are actually real and that we'll ever encounter them. Could Pratyekabuddhas be the same? If there are immeasurable kinds of sentient beings, could that mean that there are beings who are like the monkeys that write Shakespeare on a typewriter on their first try without reading Shakespeare or even knowing English? I don't mean to denigrate the achievements of the Pratyekabuddhas here. It is an incredible achievement to write Shakespeare, especially if you don't know English or even what typewriters are. And I also don't mean to denigrate their effort and their study as well. They clearly work very hard because they have to extrapolate the entire Dharma just from what they can observe with their six senses. And that is an incredibly, extraordinarily difficult thing to do and quite an achievement. My point is to say that it is possible that the capacity of a sentient being to do all of that and their follow-through in actually doing all of it could just be a statistical possibility rather than an observable reality. It is technically, statistically possible that sitting here, lightning will strike an airplane directly above my home and directly below the North Star. This is astronomically improbable, but still possible. Another way of understanding Pratyekabuddhas is to be more free in our interpretation of them and ask this question: was our Shakyamuni Buddha a Pratyekabuddha? Siddhartha Gautama never heard the Dharma preached to him during his final reincarnation. Siddhartha Gautama did not have a Sangha before he created one. He sat down all on his own under the Bodhi tree and achieved enlightenment. Of course, later on, he taught others and established a Sangha and so on and so forth, but in a sense, the historical Buddha did it a lot like the Pratyekabuddhas are said to do it. Remember that the definition of Buddha was essentially a person who had attained enlightenment. It was not until later that Buddha had all of these other connotations and characteristics. That being the case, Pratyekabuddhas could possibly be free from all of the constrictive and contradictory requirements that we've spent a whole episode discussing. It's just really hard to make that leap for me because it's an open question whether the Buddha achieved his enlightenment during his lifetime or if he was originally enlightened prior to, and only did the whole renunciation from the palace as a skillful means to teach others. Plus, in the biography of the Buddha, we have all of this talk at the birth of the Buddha that everybody, including the Buddha himself, knew that he was the Buddha and that he was no longer going to be reborn in the realms of transmigration. Plus, Siddhartha Gautama had received his prophecy in a past life and had been preached to and had made offerings to the Buddhas, and so it's hard to say that he was really a Pratyekabuddha.
I'm speculating here, but I note one thing that might help explain what's going on here. The fact that they're only able to arise in an age where the Dharma is completely lost means that as soon as our Buddha starts preaching, there are really no more of them arising, right? It makes them kind of unimportant. They can't arise now, and the Buddha has a noted preference to focus on the here and now, so why talk about something that's not going to happen for a while? This could also help explain why there are so many contradictory and unclear descriptions of them. And so something that's less important is going to get less focus. From my own experience doing game design stuff, I can tell you how difficult it is to keep all the facts in your head as you're doing things and going on. Stretch that out over cultures and languages and time, and between its relative unimportance and the spiraling complexity of everything else in Buddhism, the rules for these folks just get lost.
That's all very true, and that does happen. And that's kind of what scholars like me make our whole lives studying about. That's kind of the bread and butter for what academics who study Buddhism are all about, is those changes that occur not because there is some explanatory mechanism within the canon, but because there is some explanatory mechanism outside of it. This is a case where if there is a change like that, the explanation is outside. There's some adaptation, some mistranslation, some interpretation, some misinterpretation that causes there to be a wholly new understanding of whatever subject is being discussed in the canon or outside of it. The weird thing about what you're saying is that the absence of a Buddha is a cause for the arising of Pratyekabuddhas, but not the only cause. For every rule in place for a Pratyekabuddha, there is an exception. At the end of it all, how to understand Pratyekabuddhas is a totally open question and a totally open issue. I think that you can go spinning round and around and around, back and forth, trying to answer it according to not only the rules prescribed by the definition, if you can even hammer down a definition, but also by the different interpretations and the different positions they hold throughout the Pali Canon and the Taisho Canon and more. There's no resolved and settled interpretation of Pratyekabuddhas or their status in the canon, and I think that we're just left to speculate and wonder about them.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion of Pratyekabuddhas. Join us next week where we will discuss devas. What are devas in Buddhism? What is their status in the canon? How ought we understand them?
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.